In this episode of the Caustic Rebel podcast.
And so when his host, Jordan, said, I presume that due to this exponential increase in computation, it allows you to simulate them rather than having to build them.
Yeah.
Nothing was said. Like it was crickets. And I'm watching, I'm like, no, that's not correct. Go report.
Got it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Caustic Rebel podcast. I'm Peter O'Shea.
And I'm Tom Quinn, coming at you live from Thun, Switzerland. PJ, I believe, is in Vancouver, as usual. And the subject of our podcast today is a continuation of a discussion that we were having on our previous podcast of a recent conversation between Jordan Peterson on his podcast with Dr. Dennis Whyte of MIT regarding fusion energy. And in the last podcast, towards the end, PJ, we were discussing things rather superficially through most of our discussion.
Thanks.
And but towards the end, you alluded to a couple of instances in the Peterson podcast where Dr. Whyte was conspicuously silent, as you described it. I mean, the way that podcast went was Dennis was very often discussing things which are quite complex, and Jordan Peterson tended to summarize them the best he could for his audience, with the assumption that Dr. Whyte or Dennis would correct him if he's wrong. There's kind of like an implication of, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the way I see what you're talking about.
I think that is, by the way, I have a slide up. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
I think we also touched on Jordan's interest in the concept of truth, and I think anyone sort of, when they say, can you place fusion in a proper context of our pursuit of reliable energy? You sort of expect the truth, but also there's this whole truth and nothing but the truth element. And I think I did say that, like Dennis's description, it was 90 minutes long. It was packed with truths. And I just think that where he, in my opinion, fell down in the obligation to put fusion in a proper context was on the whole truth. You can say things that are true and then be silent on the things that are also true, but probably should be mentioned. You can also say things that are true, but not meaningfully so. Like we talked about the power of computation and how it applies to fusion, and computation across the board is skyrocketing constantly, and every field benefits from it. But there are certain problems that are solved computationally, and fusion plasmas are not one. And I gave a quote from an expert in inertial fusion who strongly supported that suggestion on my part. And there was this key moment in I don't know if we can try to bring it up again, key moment in the podcast where Jordan, trying to summarize, said, and okay, that's great, you have all this extra, computational power, and I presume that that's sufficient to allow you to model things without the need to build it. I'll see if I can bring this up.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, no, it's okay. I mean,
okay.
what I'm more curious about, PJ, is like my background, as you know, is like applied physics, but more mechanical engineering, right? My experience is more with mechanical engineering, and for many years in that field, people do, for example, computational fluid dynamics calculations. Sure. I don't do it myself, but I know lots of people who do it, and I mean that's you know, for a mechanical engineer, anyways, that's pretty complicated stuff.
It is.
Right? There's
I'm going to come across many times in this podcast as somehow diminishing how hard certain solved problems are, or solvable problems are. Just because it's solvable doesn't mean it's easy in any way. Like,
no. Yeah,
computational fluid dynamics is a real active field.
Yeah.
But compared to computational plasma physics, CFD is solved, and fusion plasmas are not. And it all has to do with complexity, and the big difference was touched on in the podcast. Had to do with action at a distance. That's certainly one of the reasons why it's so amazingly complex and evades predictive simulation to this day. And from the quote in the last podcast, will do so in inertial fusion for another 2 decades to come, even if Moore's law continues apace for that time.
I mean, the way that statement was made, it was at least 2 decades.
Yes. Yeah. Right? Like he was just like, and the conclusion to that very powerful statement, which I agree with, was that therefore we will always have to strongly underpin our any computation we do with empirical data measurements.
Yeah. Okay.
And there was one of the first articles I wrote on LinkedIn there, which was basically like you always have to ask the plasma. It's almost like a creature. It's so complex. So to some degree, fusion science it's almost like observational biology. That these very exotic creatures that can be made to come to Earth in this magnetic bottle, and they behave in very strange ways, skittish, uncooperative. So I don't know. I think you wanted to sort of press me on the nature of that complexity.
Well, I was just wondering if it's possible to summarize reasonably quickly why plasma fusion simulation is so difficult. Like you mentioned, action at a distance. I was wondering if you can't treat it as a continuum, or like what are the...
That's also true
Really?
in many cases. Yeah, like there's a field, subfield in fusion called Magneto hydrodynamics. So there's hydrodynamics, which take fluids of gases or liquids, and you underpinning those studies, because you're in a state of collisionality, etc. It's okay to assume many things about the ensemble of particles, and you treat them like a fluid. But that's washing away all kinds of complexity. When you say it's a fluid, you're taking moments of the velocity distribution and manipulating those. And under many circumstances, that's completely valid in fluid dynamics. It's almost never completely valid in plasma physics. And that has to do, well, there's that Magneto out in front, Magneto hydrodynamics, MHD. Yeah. It's a really complex field. The only PhD, or the only Nobel Prize in physics awarded to a plasma physicist was given to this gentleman, Hans Alfvén, who laid all the foundation for MHD. Basically, he didn't solve it. He just was like, okay, here are, here's how we can begin to approach this otherwise like hideously complex field. And that's just MHD. That's a completely valid, completely useful subfield of computational plasma physics. But to suggest that it's complete and predictive is incorrect.
Okay.
And to remain silent on the presumption that it is, I think is a failing in terms of trying to get the word out on what what the real context is for fusion. But I don't know, we can talk about, I'd like to talk about sort of plasma physics and wave my hands around. Dennis did a really good job in the first hour of that podcast, talking about ions and electrons and their collisions and why it's hard to get them to fuse, etc. And he did talk about some of the complexity. At some point, let's see if we can get him to say a few words.
Wow. So you see the physical coupling in this is complex because there's essentially three independent species sort of navigating this with each other through collisions and power balance. This is just one of the kinds of complexities that we deal with in fusion systems.
So we got a wow out of him, and I agree. There's a real wow of complexity to plasma physics. And there he was talking about three sort of subfluids in a plasma. And I think Dennis was saying, hey, so when you finally get a plasma, fusion plasma to ignite, you're going to need the charged fusion reactants to stay somewhat confined in the magnetic bottle so that they can collide with the merely white hot ions and electrons and keep them warm enough to what? To keep fusing.
Yeah. Okay.
And so he was saying, wow, there's the electrons doing their thing. There's the sort of the thermal ions doing their thing. And then you have the products of the fusion reactants. That's one of the complex things. He said that at the end of the quote. That's just one of the, the thing I really boggles my mind is, it's, you got fluid dynamics like with air and water, and that's really complex. We need to, throw huge computers at it to see, how an airplane's drag goes. And there's some serious computation going in there, but there's no electricity and magnetism at all. And so now takes the complexity of all these, billions of particles colliding and flowing at whatever, and give them a charge so they repel each other, simultaneously interact with the Coulomb force with a million other particles. That right there is insane amount of complexity.
Yeah.
And it's not just the electric force. When you have these things flying around and moving in concert, because you've put voltages on them, they make currents. Currents make magnetic fields.
Yeah.
And those magnetic fields act over the large distances in the plasma. Magneto hydrodynamics is inconceivably more complex than hydrodynamics, and therefore defies predictive computation in most situations relevant to fusion plasmas. And so when his host, Jordan, said, I presume that due to this exponential increase in computation, it allows you to simulate them rather than having to build them.
Yeah.
Nothing was said. That's like it was crickets. And I'm watching, I'm like, No. That's not correct. That is why the spin-off company from MIT is going gangbusters, building the next generation tokamak. And guess what? No one can predict exactly what's going to happen. Like, not even, of course, not exactly, but I'd say meaningful, very, very meaningful things are at this point unknowable.
One thing I'm curious about is how much of the activity, say, in Dennis's lab or the plasma fusion initiative that he's leading, how much of that activity is computational?
In the day when I was a grad student, I would say, okay, we were building a tokamak, running a tokamak, measuring what was happening in a tokamak. We were all very experimental.
Yeah, you need some kind of interpretation, right, of your data.
Yeah. It's not just like, well, whatever, and you don't just shrug and walk away. Of course, you, within the limits of your ever expanding computational power, you're trying to confirm theory, you're trying to verify which of these competing elements of interaction are dominating under these circumstances. Okay, we turn this knob from first principles. If it was, phenomenon A, it should go down like the knob setting squared or something. And you look at the trends, and this you do all the time. But
actual simulation of a tokamak
of the whole damn tokamak, forget it. Forget it. And then in the first article I wrote, I did. It was interesting to sort of put the numbers in front of myself. If you look at a fusion tokamak, you ask yourself, okay, well, of the things that matter, of the things that could ruin my day or get us free energy someday, what are the range of time scales of the dynamics that we care about? What are the range of the length scales that we care about? What are the range of the energy scales that we care about? And the ranges are really quite incredible. In this case, I believe, as I was saying, that one cannot predictively simulate an entire tokamak. You just can't. And for instance, the range of relevant time, length, and energy scales involved in tokamak are huge. This little slide here, can you see my mouse?
Maybe. I think so.
Okay. Regarding time scales, I should have changed the slide. This is technically a ratio of 2 times. But it's a time times the frequency. The energy confinement time in one of these big old tokamaks, like the sort of like, if you stop heating it, how long will it cool down? Is seconds. Yet so it's really long. Okay, compared to what? Compared to the little tiny electrons buzzing around the magnetic field lines that you put them on in this bottle.
Okay.
The number of times that an electron will go around the field line in one energy confinement time is 10 to the 10th.
Okay.
10 billion times. So that's a pretty large range of time. In terms of length, again, just look, obviously the physical size of the device matters. Like, how big is your tokamak? That's meters.
Yeah.
And in Dennis's excellent tutorial on fusion, he talked about, and I talked about a little bit, when you strip off the electrons from one of these ions, you don't interact with every other electron in the plasma. Yeah. It turns out that there's a continuous sort of screening.
Yeah.
And there's a typical, depending on the density, et cetera, there's a decay length of the electrostatic influence, and that's called this Debye length.
Yeah.
And in a fusion plasma, the range of the size of the plasma to the Debye screening length is, 10 to the 5.
Hey, just as an aside,
Yeah.
can I put this in there? I mentioned in the last podcast that I studied cartilage biomechanics. There's a Debye length in that's relevant to the function of cartilage molecules. Yeah, molecules in the extracellular matrix. Yeah,
And it has to do with screening of electrostatic influence.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. It's the same.
Yeah.
Same
Well,
idea.
there you go. Bob's your uncle. And finally, energy scales. Like, boom, hopefully you get some fusion. I think I said earlier that those fusion products come off at a 10 million electron volts. At somewhere on your tokamaks inner surface, there will be kind of hot plasma exhaust, some of which will impinge on the material, on the wall, and you're going to be sputtering it. You're going to be ionizing it, and to rip an electron off of any kind of atom at room temperature, it's about 1 eV. So, I mean, that matters. It matters how you're interacting with the cold wall way in the edge, and it also matters the dynamics of this 10 million electron volt fusion product. Like, to get one computer program which can cover 10 orders of magnitude in time, 5 in length, and not 6 but 7 in energy, it just doesn't work. It's like, it doesn't. And anyone that's going to naysay to me from the tokamak world, saying, yeah, we can simulate, I'm like, all right, when's the next disruption happening?
What does that refer to?
We'll talk about that in episode 3. That is one of the dragons that can bring down the whole field.
Tune in next time, dear listener, as your dynamic duo tackle other daunting questions with other guests. Stay tuned for our upcoming 3-part series with Conor McGregor.
Well, a wrecking ball is swinging, ringside bells are ringing.